who was the best Domestique of 2022. We have some big iconic Domestique performances with, I feel like Satellite Riders use went up this year, Benji, probably because everyone listens to the pod now. There's just lots of notable examples of it. There's also notable examples where there was the chess match where even if it didn't work out, you could see teams were trying to get riders in the break, like McNulty on Pagure.
This video is brought to you by Zwift. Whether you're just starting out on your cycling journey or are looking for those final tune-ups ahead of a big event or race, Zwift is the online cycling platform that makes things fun. There are 9 different worlds, thousands of kilometers of virtual road, including replicas of real-world climbs like Alpe du Zwift. There's workouts, training plans, events, and even races for every level of rider. Zwift's massive community means you're never alone on the road. So if you want to know more about Zwift or want to start your 7-day trial for free, head to Zwift.com below.
Yeah, there was Kamna, Van Aert on Hautacam. How do we balance those before we get into the discussion of the riders? Balance those really high-profile ones against the guys in the trenches doing the dirty work, pulling from 50Ks to 15Ks, keeping guys in front position like a de Klerk, like a Van Hooijdonk.
It's very difficult to balance that. It's very difficult to compare a performance of like a Vervaeke who was on Sierra Nevada compared to a de Klerk early on in Edwards door Vlaanderen, for example. So it's basically subjective on what we both watched and what we both experienced when watching the races. So that's how I view it, at least. And there's multiple aspects to that. You can also say like, oh, are we not being a bit more biased to World Tour riders by experiencing more the World Tour races, and then there's like some legendary Domestique in the Conti trenches that we don't know about that will just pop up out of nowhere in a few years? Who knows? We don't know that, but we'll talk about what we know. And like you mentioned, Kamna is one of the riders that can be mentioned, was an essential satellite rider in the Giro d'Italia on stage 20, and also had some chances for himself, but that's not to be judged in this Domestique award. So he played a big role in Hindley's victory at that Giro d'Italia. Wout van Aert played a role in Vingegaard's victory at the Tour de France, was in the break so many times, both for himself in the green jersey, but also for Vingegaard as a satellite rider up the road. And these are 2 examples of satellite riders. Another example is Tish Benoit, where he was a satellite rider once in the Tour, but that didn't really work out that stage. So that was not really...
His job was to pull the brake, so he kept the gap for Wout, I think, because he'd crashed and he was a bit injured, I think.
Yeah, and next to that, he was also part in the Cobble season, part of the team that tried launching Wout van Aert and Laporte, also in some races as co-leader. So he's like a bit of the balance between a co-leader and a Domestique. So we got to keep that in mind as well. Wout Poels being a strong Domestique for Landa at the Giro d'Italia, very underrated performance, I think, in my eyes. I think at a certain stage he was there with the 3 best climbers in the race. So that defines being a super Domestique at its core, like in his heydays back in the day when he was at Froome's side. Oh, wonderful performances by Wout Poels as Domestique in the past. But then we've got 3 other riders, and 2 of those are the ones you mentioned as well. And Nathan van Hooijdonk is one that is a strong Domestique early on in races. And we saw that in the Cobble races, but also in the Tour de France, where he played a role in controlling the breakaway. And at the Cobble races also was used to be sent forward in groups, which is also kind of a Domestique role because you're playing the bait up the road. So you're being forced to play the bait in favor of your team leader. So I consider that also a Domestique functionality in a race. Ben Turner also very strong on the cobbles and the hill classics. The way he destroyed on Amstel half the peloton on those consecutive hills before we saw the launch of Kwiatkowski and Pidcock, that was ruthless by Ben Turner. And we saw that in many races that he did. Sorry, what?
Tour de Hungary, he did the huge lead out on the hill for Dunbar, and Dunbar couldn't finish it off. I know it's a 2-1 race, but like he can climb all right on shallow gradients. Even was he in the Vuelta? He was in the Vuelta, right? I swear he did the run-ins into the base of climbs, and then Ineos didn't do anything, but he kept the guys in front too. So he was good for a lot of the year. Whereas like Kamna, I knock because it's just a one-off.
Yeah.
And then he's largely a stage hunter. Sorry, were there any last candidates for you, Benji?
I think the biggest underrated one for me of the ones that I haven't mentioned is probably Valentin Madouas, because there is no bloody way that David Gaudu ends fourth in the Tour
No
de France without Valentin Madouas by his side, because that man saved Gaudu's soul multiple times during that race, brought him back to groups multiple times, was by his side on every single climb, threw away all his own chances in the Tour, because this man can win a Tour de France stage, I'd say relatively easily, but he's by Gaudu's side, and he's part of that fourth spot of Gaudu. So that's one of the riders that's in there that I do put very highly. But are there names like, what do you think about it, Tim de Klerk this year? Because he couldn't really show it due to the injury early on, eh?
He was sick or injured. He just didn't race enough in the big races. Rein Tarame I'd put out there for Jan Hirt. I think Tarame was proved like he was just a good domestique for Jan Hirt, UAE Tour, and then in the Oman, and then I can't remember, maybe in the Giro, I think. I think Tarame was good. It's tough because I'm sure there are guys, right, who are bringing a guy back, a GC leader who's in the 7th to 10 region in a World Tour GC race, stage race, and they bring him back from, say, Group 2 to Group 1, and they do it a couple of times, but we don't see it on TV or on camera as much. We don't really notice as much. So, and you can't go on PCS and look up best domestique rankings. Like, it's very subjective. And maybe Madouas I don't have in my top 3. Ooh. I acknowledge hugely important for Gaudu in the Tour de France, but ultimately he helped a guy get 4th in the Tour instead of 6th. And it's maybe because I didn't watch, or I can't remember in February, did he help in Fourn-Ardèche and Drôme Classic, the French one days? Did he help in other stage races? Maybe I'm knocking him a little bit, but I can only go off what I remember. Like, are there any other, did he do anything else? Because in the Classics, he was a co-leader.
He was co-leader, but I do remember him playing a role for Kung in one of the races, as in riding in a group where Kung was a part of, for example. But that aside, I do want to mention, are we underrating the super domestiques of UAE and Jumbo a bit? As in, we haven't mentioned the Sepkus, who was on this list last year. We haven't mentioned the McNulty or the Soler, who have been playing a role for UAE. Mikel Biel, who played a role for UAE, but was very inconsistent at the Tour de France. Where do you rate those performances compared to the names we've already mentioned?
And the UA guys know. McNulty was good on stage 17, but otherwise didn't influence any outcomes for Pog, I don't think. Soler was solid, but was a domestique for one race, the Tour, and on Galibier made a huge mistake. And then Bjerg is not very good. So Bjerg is part of the reason they had so much trouble in the Tour. So no, Koos, Houtekam, huge pacing. Like, Koos' performance on Houtekam, right, is more important than what Van Aert did. Yes, Van Aert dropped Pog, but that's only because Koos paced for 15, 17 minutes at a really high tempo. Koos was very consistent. He's paced on Pergur, shut it down. It's also one race, you know, and I'm really looking at work across the season. So that's why I have my list, Nathan van Hooijdonk first. I'm giving it to the men in the trenches. You go from the classics. Benji mentioned he was baiting. You have Paris-Nice lining up stage 1, Calais stage, keeping them in position on his own in the run-in from 25Ks, and then launching the climb. You have the whole Tour de France. Jumbo-Visma had significantly less problems in the sprint stages or mixed stages when Van Hooijdonk was on the front, and he did a good job in Denmark. And yeah, he was just good. So I have him first. I have Van Aert second. When you single-handedly save the guys to win a one-week GC, that counts for a lot. Paris-Nice. Tour de France, I think him being there, like, cobble stage was weird at the start. I think there was a few mistakes there from him in particular, but then he ultimately did pull Vingegaard back. Then Housekam was great, of course. And I just more think the threat of him up the road and him sacrificing in that sense in the last week and a half, Pogačar, I think, it played on him a bit. So I think he was hugely important in the Tour. And so I have him second, and third I have, who do I have in my notes? Turner. I think Turner was absolutely classic stage races throughout the year. Even like I know I'm mentioning Tour de Hungary, but I think he could do even more. I think he can do even more, and I have him third.
I get that. Now, my list is different. Let that be clear. Doesn't mean that it's completely different because you got two of the same riders in that top three, but the third spot is different. I don't have Van Aert in my top three, and I agree that Paris is an event where he fully rode himself away to save that GC of Primož Roglic. So that's a light point that would deserve him a top three spot. I agree with that, but I went more for three riders that completely rode their own chances away, chances that I think they do have in certain races, to be a complete domestique in parts of the season. And the third spot for me is Valentin Madouas because I do value that Tour de France domestique performance. But because, like, when you say Van Aert did that at Paris-Nice to save the victory for Primož Roglic, yes, but I find it more gloriful that Madouas threw away all his chances to get someone to fourth position completely. I think that's also spectacular. So that's why I've got him in third spot, Valentin Madouas. I rate him, and I hope he gets a lot of chances next year because he's an absolute goat, and he can top 10 every monument, and I've been saying that for 17 years, but it hasn't happened yet.
He's quite big.
Yep.
Sorry, just to interject, Madouas, I think I mentioned this before. He and Pinot, I was not having breakfast with them, but the day after the Champs-Elysees stage, they were down at breakfast in the same hotel. And Pinot looks like Pinot does, skinny, I think about 6'6", around there. But Madouas, big guy. Like, he was way bigger than I expected. And for him to climb like that, and that means, the reason I mention that is the draft benefit he provides is more than if it's a Pozzo or Evenepoel. Like, I'm saying, he must provide a lot of benefit as a domestique, up, down, flat, wherever.
I've got Ben Turner in second. Also a name you mentioned for your top three. I think it's a strong domestique. Threw a lot of chances away at the Cobble season where he might have been one of the stronger riders at the team. And even in Roubaix, for example, they're playing that two-up game. They're rolling attacks on the others in that group, which Van Baarle ends up riding away from. The factor that Turner is there is also a form of domestique work for Van Baarle because he lifts pressure of Van Baarle to have to do it alone. Yeah, he was probably co-leader at that point in the race, so it's kind of on the edge. I'll agree with that. But the work at Amstel and so forth, and you said it, at the Vuelta, going towards the start of climbs, keeping riders in position, that's vital as well, and he did that in so many races. And that brings me to my first spot, which is also Nathan van Hooijdonk. And one factor that I think you didn't mention, one event that you didn't mention was at the Tyenberg, I think, in E3, he was also the one that lined up the entire peloton before they got to the Tyenberg, where eventually we had the attack of Laporte, Wout, and the group that they eventually went within that race. So that's also a very vital moment that gave them a lot in that classic. And in all the classics, he played a big role. In the Hill Classics, he played a role in Amstel by going up the road early. In the Tour de France, he played a role by working early on. He was a satellite rider in some stages. He was vital for the Jumbo-Visma team, and I think he's the best domestique in the world. And let me call out Belgian media for a second. I love my Belgian media journalists, but the Kristallen Fits, which is like a trophy that is given in Belgian media, together with the Flandrien trophy, they both have a domestique award. And they gave it to Benoot.
Have 2 awards?
They gave it to Benoot and Van Wilder, and not Van Hooijdonk. And even Benoot said afterwards, I didn't deserve it, Van Hooijdonk deserved it. So,
what did Van Wilder do?
Well, Van Wilder did play a role in the Vuelta, but I'd argue that it's on the edge with Vervaeke. Like, both these riders could be named to be top 10 domestiques.
Vervaeke was better.
I think Vervaeke was more vital at the right moments. For example, the Sierra Nevada satellite rider moment for Vervaeke, that's a godlike performance. But I do believe if Van Wilder is in the breakaway that day, he can do the same thing. So it's kind of the quick step tactic. Choosing Vervaeke instead of Van Wilder makes us put Vervaeke above Van Wilder, in my opinion, in this ranking.
Oh, San Sebastian on Highescabel Vervaeke was good too. Yeah. I think, Anyway, I don't know how you have 2 awards shows. But that was our domestique rankings. Let us know if we missed anybody or what your rankings would be.